The security guard stood rigid, arms crossed, a living barrier between the woman and the entrance she sought. His eyes narrowed as she approached, scanning her from head to toe. She walked with purpose, chin held high, her smart business attire a stark contrast to his preconceived notions. As their gazes met, an unspoken tension crackled in the air. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't let you in," he drawled, his voice dripping with feigned politeness. "This is a private event." The woman's brow furrowed, a mix of confusion and frustration etching across her face. "There must be some mistake," she insisted, reaching for her phone. "I have an invitation right here." But the guard wouldn't budge. He shook his head, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I think you might be at the wrong place. Why don't you try down the street?" She stood there, momentarily stunned by the blatant dismissal. Other guests streamed past, barely sparing a glance at the unfolding scene. The woman's hands clenched at her sides, a storm of emotions brewing behind her eyes. "I assure you, I am exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said, her voice calm but steely. "Now, if you'll just check the guest list." The guard cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Look, I don't want any trouble, but I've got my orders, and you're not getting in. Now, move along before I have to call for backup." Something in his tone, in the way his eyes slid past her as if she were invisible, ignited a fire in her chest. She took a deep breath, straightening her spine. "Very well," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I'll be back." As she turned on her heel and walked away, the guard's laughter followed her like a taunt. But little did he know, this wasn't the end of their encounter. It was merely the beginning. Hours later, the same woman stood before a mirror, adjusting her blazer with trembling hands. The sting of humiliation had faded, replaced by a steely resolve. She'd spent years climbing the corporate ladder, facing obstacles and prejudices at every turn, but never had she imagined she'd be turned away from her own company's event. She thought back to the long nights, the sacrifices, the doubters she'd proved wrong time and time again. A small smile tugged at her lips as she remembered signing the final papers just days ago. Owner, CEO, the titles still felt surreal, but they were hers, earned through grit and determination. With one final deep breath, she grabbed her keys and headed out. The drive back to the venue was a blur of street lights and nervous energy. As she pulled into the parking lot, she caught sight of the security guard, still standing sentry at the entrance. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached, head held high. The guard's eyes widened in recognition, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "You again?" he said, his voice a mix of annoyance and disbelief. "I thought I made myself clear earlier." The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you did," she replied, her tone deceptively light. "And now it's my turn to make things clear." She reached into her bag, pulling out a folder. The guard's gaze darted between her face and the documents she held out to him. "What's this?" he asked, reluctantly taking the papers. "This," she said, her voice steady and sure, "is proof that I not only belong here, but that I own this entire building and the company hosting tonight's event." The color drained from the guard's face as he scanned the documents, realization dawning in his eyes. He looked up, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I didn't know," he stammered, all bravado evaporating. "If I had known who you were." "That's precisely the problem." She cut him off, her words sharp as a knife. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with basic respect and dignity." The guard's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. Around them, other guests began to take notice, whispers and curious glances rippling through the crowd. "I've worked too hard and come too far to let anyone make me feel small," the woman continued, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Not you, not anyone." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. The guard stood frozen, a sheen of sweat visible on his forehead. "Now," she said, her tone brooking no argument, "I think it's time we had a conversation about your future employment, or rather, the lack thereof." As she gestured for the guard to follow her inside, a hush fell over the gathered onlookers. The woman who had been turned away hours ago now walked through the doors with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. Inside, the event was in full swing. Music pulsed through the air, mingling with the buzz of conversation and clinking glasses. But as the woman made her entrance, a ripple of recognition spread through the room. Heads turned, conversations halted mid-sentence. She felt the weight of every gaze, some curious, others admiring, a few tinged with surprise or even discomfort. But she didn't falter. This was her moment, her triumph, and she would savor every second of it. As she made her way through the crowd, snippets of whispered conversations reached her ears. Is that really her? I can't believe they almost didn't let her in. Did you see the look on that guard's face? She allowed herself a small smile, not of gloating, but of quiet satisfaction. Years of being underestimated, overlooked, and pushed aside had led to this moment. And while part of her wished it hadn't come to this, another part relished the opportunity to set things right. The security guard trailed behind her, his earlier bravado replaced by a nervous energy that was palpable even in the crowded room. As they reached a quiet corner, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. I think, she began, her voice low but firm, we need to have a serious discussion about the culture of this company and the values we uphold. The guard swallowed hard, nodding almost imperceptibly. Around them, the party continued, but in this moment, it felt as if they were in a bubble, removed from the festivities. What happens next, she continued, will depend on your willingness to learn and grow from this experience. As she prepared to deliver her decision, a mix of emotions played across her face. There was anger, yes, but also determination, hope, and a fierce desire to create positive change. The story of what transpired that night would soon spread far beyond the walls of that building. It would spark conversations, challenge assumptions, and inspire others to stand up against injustice. But in that moment, as owner and employee stood face to face, the future hung in the balance. What would she decide? How would this encounter reshape the company's future? And most importantly, what lessons would be learned from this pivotal moment? The answers to these questions would unfold in the days and weeks to come, forever changing the lives of everyone involved and sending ripples through the corporate world. But for now, all eyes were on the woman who had turned rejection into an opportunity for transformation. The tension in the air was palpable as the woman faced the security guard. She took a deep breath, centering herself before speaking. Let's start with your name, she said, her voice calm but firm. James, the guard replied, his earlier cockiness replaced by nervous energy. James Benson. She nodded, committing the name to memory. Well, James, I'm Evelyn Carter. As of last week, I'm the new owner and CEO of this company, but more importantly, I'm someone who believes in second chances and the power of growth. James's eyes widened, a mix of shock and dawning realization crossing his face. Miss Carter, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry for. Evelyn held up a hand, cutting him off. I'm not interested in apologies right now, James. What I want to know is why. Why did you turn me away earlier? The guard shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. I was just following protocol, he mumbled. We were told to be extra vigilant tonight. And that vigilance somehow translated to profiling? Evelyn pressed, her tone sharpening. I'd like to know exactly what about me made you decide I didn't belong here. James's face flushed, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple. The sounds of the party seemed to fade away as he struggled to find the right words. Meanwhile, across the room, whispers and curious glances continued to follow Evelyn and James. Among the onlookers was Michael Reeves, the company's longtime head of security. His brow furrowed as he watched the interaction, a sense of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. Michael had been with the company for over 2 decades, climbing the ranks from a junior guard to his current position. He prided himself on running a tight ship, but as he observed James's clear discomfort, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. He began to make his way through the crowd, intent on intervening. But before he could reach them, Evelyn turned and caught his eye. With a subtle shake of her head, she made it clear that this was a conversation she needed to handle personally. Michael hesitated, torn between his instinct to step in and his respect for the new CEO. In the end, he nodded slightly and stepped back, but he remained close enough to overhear their conversation. Back in the corner, James was finally finding his voice. It wasn't just about you, he said, his words coming out in a rush. We were told to be wary of anyone who didn't fit the usual profile of our guests. I made an assumption, and I was wrong. I'm truly sorry. Evelyn listened intently, her expression unreadable. And who gave you these instructions? She asked. Who defined what our usual guests look like? James hesitated, his gaze flickering briefly towards Michael before returning to Evelyn. It came down from management, he said quietly. We were told it was important for the company's image. A spark of anger flashed in Evelyn's eyes, but she quickly composed herself. I see, she said, her voice low and controlled. Well, it seems we have a much bigger problem on our hands than I initially thought. She turned slightly, surveying the room. The party continued around them, a stark contrast to the intense conversation unfolding in their corner. Evelyn's mind raced, processing the implications of James's words. Here's what's going to happen, she said, turning back to James. You're suspended, effective immediately. But, she added as his face fell, this isn't the end. I want you to take this time to reflect on your actions and their consequences. When you return, you'll be part of a new company-wide training program on diversity and inclusion. James nodded, a mix of relief and apprehension washing over his face. Thank you, Ms. Carter. I promise, I'll do better. Evelyn's expression softened slightly. I hope you will, James, because what happened tonight? It can happen again, not here, not anywhere. As James turned to leave, Evelyn caught sight of Michael watching them intently. She held his gaze for a moment, a silent challenge passing between them. It was clear that their conversation was far from over. With James gone, Evelyn took a moment to collect herself. She smoothed down her blazer, a gesture that was as much about steeling her nerves as tidying her appearance. The night was far from over, and she had a feeling that confronting James was just the tip of the iceberg. She made her way through the crowd, stopping to introduce herself to employees and guests alike. Many were surprised to meet the new CEO, especially given the circumstances of her arrival. Evelyn fielded their questions with grace, all while keeping an eye on Michael, who seemed to be strategically avoiding her. As she navigated the room, Evelyn couldn't help but notice the lack of diversity among the attendees. It was a stark reminder of the work that lay ahead. She had known taking over the company would be challenging, but tonight had revealed just how deep the problems ran. Finally, after what felt like hours of small talk and forced smiles, Evelyn managed to corner Michael near the bar. Mr. Reeves, she said, her tone polite but firm. I think it's time we had a chat. Michael nodded, his face a mask of professional neutrality. Of course, Ms. Carter. Perhaps we should find somewhere more private. They made their way to a small office off the main event space. As soon as the door closed behind them, the sounds of the party muffled, Evelyn felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Here, away from prying eyes and ears, she could finally get to the bottom of what was going on. I'll cut to the chase, Michael, Evelyn said, leaning against the desk. What James told me about the instructions given to security. I need to know where that came from. Michael cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. Ms. Carter, I assure you, any policies we have in place are designed to ensure the safety and security of our guests and employees. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. That's not what I asked, Michael. I want to know who decided that safety meant turning away people based on how they look. The tension in the room was palpable as Michael struggled to find the right words. Outside, the party continued, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding behind closed doors. But within that small office, the future of the company hung in the balance. As Evelyn waited for Michael's response, her mind raced with questions. How deep did this problem go? Who else was involved? And most importantly, how could she transform a company culture that had allowed such discrimination to take root? The night was far from over, and Evelyn knew that the answers she sought might shake the very foundation of the company she had worked so hard to acquire. But as she stood there, facing down the remnants of an outdated and harmful system, she felt more certain than ever that she was exactly where she needed to be. The story of Evelyn Carter and her fight for change was just beginning, and as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the true battle for the soul of the company was about to unfold. Michael's hesitation spoke volumes. He shifted his weight, eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth. Ms. Carter, he began, his voice low, you have to understand. This company has a certain image to maintain. The policies in place were implemented long before my time, but they've always been about protecting our reputation. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Protecting our reputation by excluding people who look like me? She asked, her voice dangerously calm. Before Michael could respond, a soft knock interrupted them. The door creaked open, revealing a young woman with a worried expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there's a situation in the main hall that requires your attention, Mr. Reeves." Michael looked torn, glancing between Evelyn and the door. Evelyn nodded curtly. "We're not done here, Michael, but go handle whatever this is. I'll be right behind you." As Michael hurried out, Evelyn took a moment to collect herself. The night was unraveling in ways she hadn't anticipated, but she was determined to face each challenge head-on. In the main hall, a tense scene was unfolding. A small group of employees had gathered near the center of the room, their voices rising above the music. As Evelyn approached, she caught snippets of their heated conversation. "It's not right. You know it," a young man was saying, his face flushed with anger. "We can't keep turning a blind eye to this." An older woman in an expensive suit scoffed. "You're overreacting, Tom. This is just how things are done in the business world. If you can't handle it, maybe you're in the wrong field." Evelyn stepped into the circle, her presence immediately drawing all eyes. "What exactly are we discussing here?" she asked, her tone firm but curious. The young man, Tom, looked at her with a mix of surprise and hope. "Miss Carter, we were just talking about what happened earlier. With you and the security guard. It's not the first time something like this has happened, and some of us think it's time for a change." The older woman rolled her eyes. "And some of us think that focusing on these so-called issues will only distract from our real work. We're here to make money, not start a social movement." Evelyn held up a hand, silencing the murmurs that had started to ripple through the group. "I appreciate your candor," she said, addressing everyone. "It's clear that we have some deeply rooted issues to address. But right now, I need everyone to return to the event. We'll be having a company-wide meeting first thing Monday morning to discuss this further." As the group dispersed, Evelyn noticed a woman lingering nearby, watching her intently. She recognized her as Sarah Chen, the head of human resources. Evelyn made her way over, sensing that Sarah might have valuable insights into the company's inner workings. "Ms. Chen," Evelyn greeted her. "I get the feeling you might have some thoughts on all of this." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "More than thoughts, Ms. Carter, I have documentation. Complaints that were swept under the rug, diversity initiatives that were shut down before they could even start. I've been trying to make changes from the inside for years, but you've been met with resistance at every turn," Evelyn finished for her. Sarah nodded, a look of relief crossing her face at being understood. As they talked, Evelyn's mind raced with the implications of what she was learning. The discrimination she'd faced wasn't an isolated incident, but a symptom of a much larger problem, and it seemed that there were forces within the company actively working to maintain the status quo. Across the room, Michael watched Evelyn and Sarah's conversation with growing unease. He pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen as he typed out a message. "She knows more than we thought. We need to meet. Now." Meanwhile, James, the security guard, sat in his car in the parking lot, still reeling from the night's events. He stared at the building, conflicting emotions warring within him. Part of him wanted to drive away and never look back, but another part knew he needed to make things right. With trembling hands, he reached for his phone and pulled up the company's anonymous reporting line. He had information, things he'd seen and heard over the years that he'd always tried to ignore. But now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he knew it was time to speak up. Back inside, the party was winding down, but the tension in the air remained palpable. Evelyn stood near the entrance, saying goodbye to the last of the guests. Her mind was already racing with plans for the coming days. Investigations to launch, policies to review, culture to change. As the last guest left, Evelyn turned to survey the now quiet room. The cleaning staff had already begun their work, erasing the physical traces of the evening. The conversations, the revelations, the promises of change. Those would linger long after the last champagne glass was cleared away. She knew the road ahead would be challenging. There would be resistance, from both within and outside the company. There would be those who would fight to maintain the old ways, and others who would push for change too quickly. Finding the right balance would be crucial. But as Evelyn stood there, in the building she now owned, she felt a sense of purpose stronger than any she'd experienced before. This wasn't just about her success anymore. It was about creating a company, and perhaps, in some small way, a world. where no one would be judged by the color of their skin or the assumptions others made about them. The clock struck midnight, marking the end of a tumultuous day and the beginning of a new era for the company. Evelyn took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, and she was ready for it. As she walked towards the exit, her heels clicking on the polished floor, Evelyn couldn't help but wonder, who else within the company was like Sarah, silently fighting for change? And who, like Michael, might be working to maintain the discriminatory status quo? The answers to these questions would shape the future of the company. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The night that had started with rejection had turned into a catalyst for transformation, and Evelyn Carter was determined to see that transformation through, no matter the cost. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Evelyn spent every waking moment poring over company records, policies, and employee files. With each document she reviewed, the picture became clearer and more troubling. The discrimination she'd faced wasn't just a one-off incident. It was woven into the very fabric of the company culture. As Monday morning dawned, a nervous energy buzzed through the office. Employees clustered in small groups, whispering about the upcoming meeting. Rumors had spread like wildfire about what had transpired at the party, and speculation ran rampant about what changes the new CEO might implement. Evelyn arrived early, her determined stride carrying her through the lobby. She nodded at the security desk, where a new guard stood watch. James' absence was noticed by many, fueling even more gossip among the staff. In the executive conference room, Evelyn set up for the meeting, spreading out documents and connecting her laptop to the projector. As she worked, Sarah Chen knocked softly on the open door. "Ms. Carter, do you have a moment?" Evelyn waved her in, grateful for a friendly face. "What's on your mind, Sarah?" Sarah closed the door behind her, lowering her voice. "I've been doing some digging since our conversation at the party. There's something you need to see before the meeting." She handed Evelyn a thick file folder, her expression grim. As Evelyn flipped through the pages, her eyes widened. Employee complaints, diversity statistics, emails discussing maintaining the company image. It was all there, meticulously documented. "Sarah, how long have you been collecting this?" "Years," Sarah admitted. "I always hoped I'd find the right moment to bring it forward, but," she trailed off, the unspoken weight of her hesitation hanging in the air. Evelyn squeezed Sarah's shoulder. "You did the right thing. This changes everything." As the clock ticked closer to the meeting time, employees began filing into the large conference room. The usual chatter was subdued, replaced by an air of nervous anticipation. Evelyn stood at the front, projector remote in hand, Sarah by her side. Michael Reeves was one of the last to enter, his usual confident demeanor notably absent. He took a seat near the back, eyes darting between Evelyn and the other executives. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Evelyn cleared her throat. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I know there have been a lot of rumors circulating about what happened at the company party. Today, we're going to address those head-on." She clicked to the first slide, displaying a graph of the company's diversity statistics. Murmurs rippled through the room as employees took in the stark visual representation of their workforce's homogeneity. "This," Evelyn said, gesturing to the screen, "is not just a problem. It's a failure. A failure of leadership, of values, and of basic human decency." As she continued her presentation, laying out the evidence of systemic discrimination within the company, reactions varied. Some employees nodded in grim acknowledgement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Michael's face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the incriminating emails now displayed for all to see. Evelyn was building to her main point when suddenly, the door burst open. All heads turned to see James, the security guard from the party, standing there, out of breath and wild-eyed. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he panted, "but there's something you all need to know." The room erupted in confused chatter. Evelyn raised her hand for silence, her heart racing. "James? What's going on?" James stepped forward, his eyes locked on Evelyn. "After what happened at the party, I couldn't just let it go. I started looking into things, asking questions, and I found something. Something big." Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is highly inappropriate," he snapped. Mr. Benson, you're no longer an employee here. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. But Evelyn held up a hand. No, Michael, I want to hear what he has to say. She turned back to James. Go on. James took a deep breath, then launched into his story. He spoke of overheard conversations, of late-night meetings he'd witnessed while on duty, of documents he wasn't supposed to see but did. With each word, the tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. As James finished speaking, a heavy silence fell over the room. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to process this new information and its implications. She looked around at the shocked faces of her employees, at Sarah's grim nod of confirmation, at Michael's barely concealed panic. The moments stretched, taut as a bowstring. Evelyn knew that her next words, her next actions, would define not just her leadership but the future of the entire company. The truth was out there now, raw and uncomfortable. The question was, what would she do with it? As all eyes turned to her, waiting for her response, Evelyn took a deep breath. The climax of this confrontation was upon them, and the resolution she chose would ripple out far beyond the walls of this conference room. With steady hands, she reached for the next slide in her presentation, ready to reveal the plan that would change everything. The air crackled with anticipation. In that moment, balanced on the knife's edge between the old way and the new, anything seemed possible. And Evelyn Carter, the woman who had been denied entry just days ago, now held the power to open doors, or close them forever. Evelyn's finger hovered over the remote, ready to reveal her plan, when suddenly the conference room door swung open once again. This time, a tall woman in a crisp suit strode in, flanked by two stern-faced individuals. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the newcomers. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman announced, her voice sharp and authoritative. "But this meeting needs to end immediately." She held up a badge, the gleam of metal catching the fluorescent light. "I'm Agent Simmons with the FBI, and we're here to investigate allegations of corporate fraud and discriminatory practices." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. She locked eyes with Sarah, whose shocked expression mirrored her own. This was beyond anything they had anticipated. Agent Simmons continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "We have a warrant to search the premises and seize any relevant documents. I'll need everyone to remain here while we conduct our initial investigation." Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is outrageous. You have no right to." "Actually, Mr. Reeves." Agent Simmons cut him off. "We have every right. And I suggest you sit back down. You'll want to save your energy for the questions we have for you." As the FBI agents began to fan out across the room, Evelyn's mind whirled. How had this happened? Who had tipped off the FBI? And more importantly, what did they know? She caught sight of James, the security guard, shrinking back against the wall. His face was a mask of guilt and fear. Suddenly, it clicked. James hadn't just come here to confess to the company, he'd gone to the authorities. Evelyn took a deep breath, centering herself. This was not how she had envisioned her first week as CEO, but she was determined to face this challenge head-on. She stepped forward, addressing Agent Simmons directly. "Agent, I understand you have a job to do, but I want to assure you that we are in the middle of addressing these very issues. If you'll allow me just a few minutes to explain." But before Evelyn could finish, another commotion erupted near the back of the room. A group of employees had stood up, led by Tom, the young man from the party. "We can't stay silent any longer," he announced, his voice shaking but determined. "There's more to this story than anyone knows." The room erupted into chaos. Voices rose in anger, fear, and confusion. Some employees rushed to Tom's side, while others backed away, looking uncertain. Michael was on his feet again, his face red with fury as he pointed accusingly at Evelyn. "This is your fault," he shouted. "You come in here, stirring up trouble, and now look what's happened." Agent Simmons whistled sharply, cutting through the noise. "Enough. Everyone sit down now. Mr. Reeves, that's your last warning. Miss Carter, I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning." As Agent Simmons approached her, Evelyn's mind raced. She knew that everything she said and did in the next few moments could make or break not just her career, but the future of the entire company and everyone who worked there. She glanced at the USB drive in her hand, containing the presentation she'd prepared. the one that would have laid out her plan for transforming the company culture. Now, it seemed almost quaint in the face of a federal investigation. But as she looked around the room, at the frightened faces of her employees, at Sarah's encouraging nod, at James's remorseful expression, Evelyn felt a surge of determination. This was not the end. It was a chance to truly clean house, to rebuild from the ground up. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn turned to Agent Simmons. "I'll cooperate fully," she said, her voice steady. "But first, there's something you need to see." She held up the USB drive. "This contains evidence of systemic discrimination within the company, as well as my plan to address it. I was about to present it when you arrived." Agent Simmons raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. "And you're just volunteering this information?" Evelyn nodded firmly. "Yes, because I believe in transparency, and I believe in doing what's right, no matter how difficult it might be." As Agent Simmons took the drive, a hush fell over the room. The tension was palpable, everyone acutely aware that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in the company's history. Evelyn stood tall, her gaze sweeping across the faces of her employees. She saw fear, yes, but also hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the catalyst for real change. As she prepared to follow Agent Simmons out of the room, Evelyn turned to address her staff one last time. "I know this is scary," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But I promise you, we will get through this together. And when we do, we'll build a company we can all be proud of." With those words hanging in the air, Evelyn walked out of the conference room, head held high. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it. Challenges, surprises, and all. Behind her, the room buzzed with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. The story of Evelyn Carter and her fight for change had taken an unexpected turn, but it was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. Days turned into weeks as the FBI investigation unfolded. The company's operations ground to a near halt, with agents combing through years of records and interviewing countless employees. Evelyn found herself in a whirlwind of depositions, strategy meetings, and late nights poring over documents. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the date of reckoning arrived. The entire staff was gathered in the company's largest conference room, tension thick in the air. Evelyn stood at the front, flanked by Agent Simmons and a team of lawyers. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Evelyn took a deep breath and began to speak. "I know these past weeks have been incredibly difficult for all of us," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Today, I'm here to share the results of the investigation and our path forward." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, revealing a damning timeline of discriminatory practices dating back years. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as employees saw the full extent of the problem laid bare. "The investigation has confirmed what many of us feared," Evelyn continued. "There was indeed a systemic issue of discrimination within our company. But," she paused, her gaze sweeping the room, "it also revealed something else, something unexpected." The next slide clicked into view, showing a complex web of financial transactions. "We uncovered evidence of embezzlement on a massive scale," Evelyn explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. Funds that were meant for diversity initiatives and employee programs were being siphoned off into private accounts. All eyes turned to Michael Reeves, who sat pale and rigid in his seat. Agent Simmons stepped forward. "Mr. Reeves, you're under arrest for fraud and embezzlement." As the agents moved to handcuff him, Michael suddenly jumped to his feet. "You don't understand," he shouted, desperation in his eyes. "I had no choice. They made me do it." The room erupted in chaos as Michael was led away, his words hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. Evelyn raised her hands, calling for calm. "I know this is shocking," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "But please, let me finish. There's more you need to know." As the room settled, Evelyn revealed the final piece of the puzzle, the they Michael referred to. It turns out to be a network of executives across multiple companies, all working together to maintain what they called the old guard of business. They saw diversity as a threat to their power and profit margins. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Employees looked at each other in disbelief, trying to process the scope of the conspiracy they'd unwittingly been part of. Evelyn's voice softened as she continued. "I know this is a lot to take in, but here's the silver lining. By uncovering this network, We've not only cleaned house in our own company but sparked investigations across the entire industry. Change is coming, and we're at the forefront of it." She clicked to the final slide, revealing a comprehensive plan for rebuilding the company culture. "This is our path forward," she explained. "New hiring practices, bias training, mentorship programs, and a complete overhaul of our corporate structure. It won't be easy, but I believe we have the chance to become a model for what a truly inclusive and ethical company can be." As Evelyn finished speaking, the room fell silent. Then, slowly, applause began to build. It started with a few hesitant claps and grew into a thunderous ovation. Employees stood, some wiping away tears, others nodding with determination. Just as the applause was dying down, the door burst open. A young woman Evelyn didn't recognize rushed in, out of breath. "Miss Carter," she gasped. "You need to see this." She thrust a tablet into Evelyn's hands. On the screen was a breaking news story. "Whistleblower exposes industry-wide discrimination scandal. Multiple CEOs step down." Evelyn's eyes widened as she scanned the article. The story had broken wide open, with companies across the sector facing scrutiny and calls for reform. Their small victory had snowballed into a movement. She looked up at her employees, a mix of emotions playing across her face. "It looks like our story was just the beginning," she said, her voice filled with awe and determination. "We started something bigger than we ever imagined." As the reality of their situation sank in, a new energy filled the room. Employees began to talk excitedly, already brainstorming ideas for how they could lead the charge for industry-wide change. Evelyn stood at the front, taking it all in, from being denied entry to a party to sparking a national conversation on corporate ethics and diversity. It had been a wild journey. But looking at the passionate faces of her team, she knew this was just the beginning. "All right, everyone," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "We got work to do. Let's show the world what real change looks like." As the room erupted in cheers and applause, Evelyn felt a sense of purpose stronger than she'd ever known. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, the future looked bright, not just for her company, but for the entire industry. The story of one woman's stand against discrimination had become a catalyst for sweeping change. And as Evelyn Carter looked out at her team, ready to take on the world, she knew that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to open a door to change everything. As the initial excitement began to settle, Evelyn realized the enormity of the task ahead. Transforming a company culture was one thing, but being at the forefront of an industry-wide revolution, that was a challenge on an entirely different scale. In the weeks that followed, the company became a hive of activity. Every day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities. Evelyn found herself working longer hours than ever before, but for the first time in her career, it didn't feel like work. It felt like purpose. One morning, as she walked into the office, Evelyn noticed something different. The security desk, once a symbol of exclusion, now bore a sign that read, "Welcome Center." Behind it sat James, the former security guard whose actions had helped spark this change. "Good morning, Miss Carter." James greeted her, a nervous smile on his face. "I hope it's okay that I'm here. HR thought it might be a good idea to have a familiar face welcoming people." Evelyn smiled warmly. "It's more than okay, James. It's perfect." She paused, then added, "And please, call me Evelyn." As she made her way to her office, Evelyn reflected on how far they'd come. The company was slowly but surely transforming. Diversity hiring initiatives were in full swing, unconscious bias training was mandatory for all employees, and a new mentorship program was helping to nurture talent from all backgrounds. But it wasn't just internal changes. The company had become a beacon in the industry, regularly hosting forums and workshops on inclusive business practices. Other companies, once competitors, were now reaching out for guidance on how to implement similar changes. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. There were still resistances to overcome, both within the company and in the broader business world. Some old guard executives in other firms were pushing back hard against the wave of change, using their considerable resources to try and maintain the status quo. Evelyn found herself becoming a reluctant public figure, often asked to speak at conferences or give interviews about her experience. It was uncomfortable at times, being in the spotlight, but she knew the importance of sharing her story. One afternoon, as she was preparing for yet another interview, Sarah knocked on her office door. "Evelyn, do you have a moment?" "For you?" "Always," Evelyn replied, gesturing for Sarah to take a seat. "What's on your mind?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, about how far we've come, and I can't help but wonder, what if I had spoken up sooner? Could we have prevented some of the harm that was done?" Evelyn leaned forward, her expression serious. "Sarah, you did speak up. You kept meticulous records. You tried to implement changes where you could. In a system designed to silence people like us, you found ways to resist. Don't underestimate the courage that took." Sarah nodded, linking back tears. "Thank you. I want to make sure we're doing everything we can to prevent this from happening again. Not just here, but everywhere." "I couldn't agree more," Evelyn said, a spark of inspiration in her eyes. "In fact, I think you've just given me an idea." Over the next few months, Evelyn and her team worked tirelessly on a new initiative. They developed a comprehensive toolkit for creating inclusive workplaces, drawing on their own experiences and the lessons they'd learned. It included everything from policy templates to training modules, all designed to help other companies start their own journey towards true equality. The day they launched the toolkit was a moment of pride for the entire company. As Evelyn stood on stage, presenting their work to a room full of industry leaders, she couldn't help but think back to that night at the party. How different things might have been if she had simply walked away, accepted the rejection as just the way things are. But she hadn't walked away, she had stood her ground, and in doing so, had set off a chain of events that was now reshaping an entire industry. As she concluded her presentation, Evelyn noticed a familiar face in the audience. It was the older woman from the party, the one who had dismissed concerns about discrimination as overreacting. Their eyes met, and to Evelyn's surprise, the woman gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. Back at the office, Evelyn found a surprise waiting for her. The entire staff had gathered in the lobby, led by Tom, the young employee who had spoken up during the FBI investigation. "We wanted to thank you," Tom said, his voice filled with emotion. "Not just for the big changes, but for the small ones too. For making us feel heard, for giving us a chance to be part of the solution." One by one, employees stepped forward, sharing stories of how the company's transformation had impacted their lives. A young woman spoke about finally feeling comfortable bringing her girlfriend to office events. An older man tearfully recounted how the new mentorship program had reinvigorated his career. A group of interns excitedly discussed their plans to implement similar changes in whatever companies they joined after graduation. As Evelyn listened to their stories, she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This was why she had fought so hard. Not for accolades or recognition, but for moments like these. For the chance to create a workplace where everyone could thrive, regardless of their background or appearance. The celebration continued into the evening, with employees from all departments mingling and chatting. Evelyn found herself in a quiet corner, taking it all in, when she overheard a conversation that made her smile. "Can you believe it's been a year since the night of that party?" one employee was saying. "The night Evelyn wasn't let in?" "I know," another replied. "It's crazy to think how much has changed since then, and to think it all started because one person refused to be turned away." As the night wound down, Evelyn made her way home, her mind buzzing with plans for the future. There was still so much work to be done, so many more barriers to break down. But looking back at how far they'd come, she felt a surge of hope. The next morning, as Evelyn approached the office building, she paused for a moment, looking up at the company logo. It was the same logo that had adorned the building a year ago, but now it seemed to stand for something different, something better. She took a deep breath and walked through the doors, greeted by James' warm smile at the welcome center. As she made her way to her office, surrounded by the buzz of her diverse and energized team, Evelyn couldn't help but smile. This was more than just a workplace now. It was a community, a movement, a testament to what could happen when people came together to demand change. And as she settled in for another day of pushing boundaries and opening doors, Evelyn knew that their journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.